A man sits alone in a corner of a coffee shop, book in hand, completely absorbed in his reading. No phone, no laptop, no one to talk to. Just him and the written word. People walk past and they notice him. But here's what's interesting. They don't just notice him, they feel something. Discomfort, curiosity, maybe even a hint of threat. Why does a man reading alone make people so uncomfortable? Because he's doing something society has worked tirelessly to eliminate. He's thinking for himself. And that's terrifying. Carl Jung spent his entire life studying the human psyche, and what he discovered was this. The man who reads alone isn't just consuming information. He's building something far more dangerous. Independent thought. The capacity to question everything. The ability to see through the comfortable lies society needs you to believe. And once you develop that ability, you become impossible to control. Think about the last time you saw someone truly absorbed in reading. Not scrolling through social media, not skimming headlines, actually reading. Deep, focused, undistracted reading. How rare was that? Now ask yourself why. In a world where everyone is connected, constantly stimulated, perpetually distracted, the man who chooses solitude and books is making a statement. He's saying, I don't need your validation. I don't need your entertainment. I don't need your approved sources of information. I have access to the greatest minds in human history, and I'm choosing to learn from them instead of from you. That choice, that simple act of reading alone, threatens the entire social order. Because the man who reads widely, thinks deeply, and questions constantly cannot be easily manipulated. He's developed what Jung called psychological sovereignty, complete ownership of his own mind. And that sovereignty is contagious. When other men see him thriving in solitude, gaining knowledge independently, thinking for himself, they start asking dangerous questions. Do I really need to be constantly connected? Am I consuming information, or is information consuming me? What would I discover if I spent time alone with challenging ideas? These questions terrify a world built on your compliance. So let me show you exactly why society fears the man who reads alone. And by the end of this, you won't just understand this fear. You'll recognize how it's been operating in your own life. You'll see the invisible pressure you've been under to stay distracted, stay connected, stay controllable. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. Let's start with something that will make you angry. You've been trained since childhood to fear solitude. Think about it. From the moment you entered school, what was the message? Be social, make friends, join groups, work in teams, collaborative learning, group projects, social skills. Every single system you've been through has emphasized one thing. You need other people. And while connection is valuable, something sinister has happened. Society has conflated solitude with loneliness, being alone with being inadequate, independence with isolation. Jung saw through this manipulation immediately. He wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But here's what he understood that most people miss. You cannot become who you truly are in a crowd. You cannot discover your authentic self while constantly reacting to others. You cannot develop independent thought while swimming in groupthink. The man who reads alone has rejected this programming. He's discovered that solitude isn't isolation, it's liberation. Not loneliness, but necessary space for psychological development. And this discovery makes him dangerous because he's no longer dependent on social approval for his sense of self. Watch what happens when you tell people you prefer spending time alone reading. They immediately diagnose you. You're antisocial, you're depressed, you're missing out on life. They treat your choice like a problem that needs solving. But here's what's really happening. Your independence threatens their dependence. Your comfort with solitude exposes their fear of being alone with their own thoughts. Your capacity for deep engagement reveals their addiction to shallow distraction. Jung called this projection. When people attack your solitary reading, they're really attacking the parts of themselves they've abandoned. The capacity for concentration, the courage to face their own mind, the strength to exist without constant external validation. And the reading itself, that makes you even more threatening. Because every book you read is a conversation with someone who isn't here to enforce social norms. Dead philosophers don't care about political correctness. Historical figures don't worry about offending modern sensibilities. Great thinkers from other cultures don't conform to your society's assumptions. When you read widely, you're essentially having conversations that society can't monitor or control. You're being influenced by minds that don't subscribe to current orthodoxies. You're developing perspectives that don't fit neatly into approved categories. This is why dictatorships burn books, why authoritarian regimes control reading lists, why every oppressive system in history has feared literacy and independent learning. It's not about the specific content, it's about the psychological independence that reading creates. The man who has read Nietzsche understands power differently than the man who hasn't. The man who has studied Jung sees through social manipulation that others accept unconsciously. The man who has explored philosophy, psychology, history, and literature has built a mental framework that makes him resistant to propaganda, immune to peer pressure, and capable of questioning authority. And here's what makes this particularly threatening in the modern world. We live in an age of unprecedented information access, but decreasing attention spans. Society has solved the problem of the reading man by making him extinct, not through book burning, but through endless distraction. Social media gives you the feeling of connection without the depth of real relationship. Streaming services provide entertainment that requires no mental effort. News feeds offer information designed to provoke reaction rather than thought. The entire digital ecosystem is engineered to prevent exactly one thing: sustained, focused, solitary engagement with complex ideas. The man who reads alone has opted out of this system. And every moment he spends with a book is a moment he's not consuming approved content, not being advertised to, not having his attention harvested and sold, not being subtly programmed with acceptable opinions. He's building psychological capital that makes him independent. And independence, real psychological independence, is the one thing the system cannot tolerate. Because independent men don't need the system. They don't need constant entertainment to feel alive. They don't need social media validation to feel valuable. They don't need approved information sources to form opinions. They've become what Jung called individuated, psychologically complete, capable of standing alone. And that capacity, it's not just threatening, it's revolutionary. Think about the hierarchy of knowledge consumption in modern society. At the bottom, you have passive scrolling, no effort required. Information comes to you pre-digested, algorithm selected, designed for instant consumption and immediate forgetting. One level up, you have video content. Slightly more engaging, but still largely passive. You're receiving information in a format that requires minimal effort. Then you have podcasts and audiobooks. Better than video because you can multitask, but still fundamentally receptive rather than active. At the top, you have reading. Deep, focused, solitary reading. And here's what makes reading different from every other form of information consumption. It requires active engagement. Your mind must work to transform symbols on a page into meaning. You must maintain focus despite having no external stimulation. You must build understanding through your own mental effort rather than having it delivered pre-formed. The man who reads alone is doing cognitive work that most people have outsourced entirely. He's building neural pathways that atrophy in those who consume only passive media. He's developing attention span in a world optimized for distraction. He's creating knowledge structures in a culture of information fragments. Jung understood that this kind of mental development was essential for psychological maturity. He called it active imagination, the capacity to engage deeply with ideas, to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to build complex understanding through sustained mental effort. But here's where it gets really threatening. The more you read, the more you realize how much of what passes for knowledge in everyday conversation is actually just repeated opinions. People aren't thinking. They're echoing. They're not forming views. They're adopting them. They're not understanding complex issues. They're choosing sides in predetermined debates. The reading man sees this immediately. He's encountered the actual arguments behind the slogans. He's read the primary sources behind the summaries. He's explored the nuances that get eliminated in popular discourse. And this makes him incredibly frustrating to everyone around him. He can't be convinced by rhetoric because he's studied rhetoric. He can't be manipulated by emotional appeals because he understands psychological tactics. He can't be swept up in mass movements because he's read about mass movements throughout history. People sense this resistance and they respond with hostility. They call him arrogant for not accepting their opinions. They call him pretentious for referencing books they haven't read. They call him elitist for suggesting that maybe, just maybe, complex issues require more than surface-level understanding. But here's what's really happening. His reading has created what Jung called psychological differentiation, the capacity to separate his own thoughts from collective thinking, his own values from social programming, his own identity from group identity. Most people never achieve this differentiation. They spend their entire lives thinking the thoughts of their culture, holding the opinions of their peers, valuing what society tells them to value. They believe they're thinking for themselves, but they're actually just selecting from pre-approved options. The man who reads alone has broken free from this limitation, not because he's smarter, but because he's put in the work. Hours and hours of sustained attention, thousands of pages of challenging material, countless encounters with ideas that made him uncomfortable, perspectives that challenged his assumptions, arguments that forced him to think harder than he wanted to. This is what society fears, not the reading itself, but what reading creates. A mind that can't be controlled, a perspective that can't be predicted, a person who has become psychologically sovereign, and sovereignty, once achieved, cannot be revoked. The man who has read widely, thought deeply, and developed genuine understanding cannot be made ignorant again. He might choose to keep quiet. He might decide that most conversations aren't worth the effort, but he knows. And that knowledge changes everything. It changes how he sees politics, recognizing the manipulation tactics used by all sides. It changes how he sees media, understanding the incentives behind what gets covered and how. It changes how he sees social dynamics, perceiving the status games and power struggles that others participate in unconsciously. Most importantly, it changes how he sees himself, not as a product of his environment, but as a conscious agent capable of self-direction. Not as someone who needs external validation, but as someone who can validate himself through understanding. Not as someone who fears being different, but as someone who has consciously chosen difference. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. The reading man has done something almost as terrifying. He's accepted that most people don't think. They react, they don't reason, they rationalize. They don't have carefully considered views. They have comfortable certainties. And once you see this, once you really see it, you face a choice. You can pretend you don't see it, go along with the comfortable fictions, participate in conversations as if they're meaningful exchanges of ideas rather than social rituals. Or you can stand apart, not with arrogance or superiority, but with quiet recognition that your relationship to knowledge, to truth, to understanding itself is fundamentally different from most people's. The man who reads alone has made this choice. And that choice, repeated day after day, book after book, creates something society cannot tolerate: a free mind. And once you've freed your mind, you start seeing the cages everyone else is living in. You see how their opinions were installed rather than developed, how their beliefs serve social functions rather than truth, how their entire intellectual life is shaped by forces they don't recognize and wouldn't admit if they did. This vision doesn't make you better than others, but it does make you different. And in a world that demands conformity, difference is dangerous. The man who reads alone isn't trying to be dangerous. He's just trying to understand. But understanding, real understanding, is the most revolutionary act possible. Because once you understand how things actually work, you can never be fooled again. And a population that can't be fooled can't be controlled. Here's something nobody talks about. Reading changes your brain structure. This isn't metaphorical. It's literal neuroscience. When you engage in deep reading, sustained focus on complex text, your brain builds new neural pathways. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for complex analysis and abstract thought, becomes more developed. The areas associated with language processing and comprehension expand. Most crucially, the neural networks that enable sustained attention and impulse control strengthen. You're not just learning information. You're rewiring your cognitive architecture. Now contrast this with what happens to brains shaped primarily by social media and video content: shorter attention spans, decreased capacity for sustained focus, weakened ability to engage with complexity, increased need for immediate stimulation. The man who reads alone is literally developing a different type of brain than the man who doesn't. And Jung would tell you this isn't just about intelligence. It's about consciousness itself, the capacity to observe your own thinking, the ability to regulate your own mental states, the strength to direct your attention deliberately rather than having it captured by whatever's most stimulating. This is what he meant by individuation, the development of consciousness to the point where you become the author of your own mental life rather than its passive observer. But society doesn't want you to have this kind of consciousness. It wants you reactive, not reflective, impulsive, not deliberate, controlled by emotion, not guided by reason. Why? Because conscious people are hard to manipulate. They notice when they're being manipulated. They recognize rhetorical tricks. They spot logical fallacies. They question premises others accept unconsciously. The man who reads philosophy has encountered every major argument about how life should be lived. He can't be convinced by simple moral assertions because he's read competing ethical frameworks. The man who reads psychology understands influence tactics. He can't be easily persuaded because he recognizes the techniques being used on him. The man who reads history sees patterns repeating. He can't be swept up in current events because he's seen the same dynamics play out dozens of times before. This immunity to manipulation, this is what makes him genuinely threatening, not to individuals, but to systems that depend on collective compliance. Watch what happens when the reading man encounters popular narratives. He immediately asks questions nobody else is asking. What assumptions underlie this narrative? What evidence supports it? What alternative explanations exist? Who benefits from this being widely believed? These questions, they're not cynicism, they're critical thinking. But in a world where most people accept narratives uncritically, asking these questions makes you seem difficult, contrarian, unnecessarily skeptical. People get frustrated with you. They want you to just accept things. Just go along. Just stop being so difficult. But you can't. Once you've developed the habit of critical analysis, once you've built the neural pathways that automatically question and examine, you can't turn them off. You're permanently changed. Jung talked about this as the burden of consciousness. Once you become aware, you can't become unaware. Once you see through illusions, you can't unsee them. Once you understand how things work, you can't pretend ignorance. The reading man carries this burden daily. He participates in conversations where everyone else accepts comfortable fictions. He watches people make decisions based on obvious fallacies. He sees society repeating mistakes documented in books written centuries ago. And he can't say anything because explaining would require people to have read what he's read, understood what he's understood, developed the frameworks he's developed. So he stays quiet, not because he's arrogant, but because he recognizes the futility of trying to compress years of reading and thinking into a casual conversation. This silence, it gets interpreted as aloofness, superiority, social awkwardness. People think he's judging them, and maybe he is, but not in the way they imagine. He's not looking down on them morally. He's recognizing that they're operating with different cognitive tools, different levels of awareness, different capacities for complexity. It's like a chess master watching beginners play. He's not contemptuous. He's just aware of dimensions of the game they don't see yet. But here's what Jung understood about this dynamic. The truly individuated person doesn't feel superior to others. He feels responsibility. Because with consciousness comes the obligation to use it well. With understanding comes the duty to act wisely. With psychological sovereignty comes the challenge of choosing how to engage with a world that hasn't achieved that sovereignty. Some reading men become cynical. They write off everyone else as hopeless. They retreat into intellectual isolation. They use their knowledge as a shield against genuine human connection. Jung would call this inflation. When your psychological development makes you feel separate from and superior to ordinary humanity. But there's another path, the path of the truly individuated man. He maintains his sovereignty while remaining engaged. He holds his understanding while staying humble. He recognizes his consciousness as a gift that brings responsibility, not a trophy that proves superiority. This man reads alone but lives in the world. He thinks independently but communicates clearly. He sees through illusions but treats others with compassion rather than contempt. He's developed what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in tension, solitude and connection, independence and relationship, critical thinking and open-hearted engagement. And this is where we arrive at the real reason society fears the reading man. Not because he's isolated, not because he's arrogant, not because he's disconnected from others, but because he represents a possibility that threatens the entire social order, the possibility of conscious, purposeful, self-directed human life. When you see a man completely absorbed in reading, alone but not lonely, focused but not tense, engaged with ideas but present in the moment, you're witnessing something rare. Someone who has taken responsibility for their own consciousness. Someone who has decided to think rather than be thought. Someone who has chosen development over comfort, understanding over certainty, growth over security. And that choice, sustained over years, creates something magnificent. A free human being. Not free from responsibility, but free for responsibility. Not free from others, but free for genuine relationship. Not free from the world, but free to engage with the world on conscious terms, rather than unconscious ones. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the fully realized individual. Not someone who has transcended humanity, but someone who has fully embraced it. Someone who has integrated their shadow, understood their complexes, recognized their projections, and still chosen to remain engaged with life. The man reading alone in the coffee shop, he might be on this path. He might be doing the inner work that transforms consciousness. He might be building the psychological capacity that enables genuine freedom. And if he is, he's doing something revolutionary. Not by fighting the system, but by becoming immune to it. Not by changing others, but by changing himself so completely that the old rules no longer apply. Society fears this because it's contagious. When one man achieves genuine psychological freedom, others notice. They sense something different about him, a quality of presence, a depth of understanding, a calm that comes from internal stability rather than external validation. They don't know what it is exactly. They can't put their finger on it, but they feel it. And some of them start asking questions. What does he know that I don't? How did he get like that? What would happen if I spent less time scrolling and more time reading? These questions, they're dangerous to a system built on psychological dependence, because they lead to the one thing the system can't survive: mass consciousness, individual sovereignty at scale. Entire populations of people who think for themselves, question authority, resist manipulation, choose their own values. This isn't fantasy. It's happened before in history. The printing press didn't just spread information. It created the Protestant Reformation by enabling individuals to read scripture themselves. The explosion of literacy in the 19th century didn't just educate people. It fueled revolutionary movements by enabling working classes to access ideas previously restricted to elites. The underground literature networks in totalitarian states didn't just share banned books. They created entire communities of conscious resistance. Reading, especially reading alone and by choice, is always politically charged, because it creates the one thing all systems of control must prevent: people who can think for themselves. And thinking for yourself, really thinking, not just having opinions but developing genuine understanding, that's the most revolutionary act available. You don't need to storm government buildings. You don't need to organize protests. You just need to sit alone with challenging books, build real understanding, develop genuine consciousness, and become the kind of person who can't be controlled. That person, multiplied across thousands and eventually millions, changes everything. Not through force, but through simple refusal to participate unconsciously. Jung saw this possibility clearly. He wrote about the importance of individual transformation in creating social change. He understood that collective problems require individual solutions. That mass consciousness begins with personal awakening. The man who reads alone is participating in this transformation. He might not see it that way. He might just think he's enjoying books, but he's doing something much more significant. He's building consciousness, developing sovereignty, creating freedom. And that process, repeated across enough individuals, eventually reaches critical mass. The comfortable lies become obviously false. The manipulation tactics become clearly visible. The systems of control become transparently ineffective, not because of revolution, but because of evolution. Individual minds evolving beyond the capacity to be controlled. And that evolution begins in solitude, in quiet corners of coffee shops, in late-night reading sessions, in moments of sustained focus that build the cognitive and psychological capacity for genuine independence. This is why society fears the man who reads alone, not because of what he's doing now, but because of what he's becoming. And what he's becoming, it can't be stopped, can't be controlled, can't be manipulated back into compliance. He's on a path toward freedom, and freedom, once genuinely achieved, is absolutely contagious. Now you face a choice that will determine everything about who you become. You've seen through the comfortable lie that constant connection makes you complete. You understand how society has programmed you to fear the solitude necessary for real thinking. You recognize that the man who reads alone isn't missing out on life but preparing for genuine living. The question burning in your mind right now isn't whether this is true. Deep down, you already know it is. The question is whether you have the courage to act on this knowledge. Every moment you've spent reading this, somewhere inside you, something shifted. You felt the pull toward depth, toward real understanding, toward the psychological sovereignty that changes everything. That pull, it's not random. That's your authentic self recognizing truth and demanding you pay attention. The men who changed history, the ones who saw what others couldn't, the minds that transformed human understanding, they all shared one practice. They read alone. They spent hours in solitude with ideas that challenged them. They built the consciousness that made greatness possible. Jung spent years studying texts nobody else bothered with, exploring depths of psychology that terrified his colleagues. And from that solitary work came insights that revolutionized how we understand the human mind. You're standing at the beginning of that same path, not because you'll become Jung, but because the process of becoming who you truly are requires the same commitment. Hours alone with challenging ideas, days building understanding nobody can give you, years developing the consciousness that makes real freedom possible. Write in the comments, I read, therefore I am. Let's see how many men are ready to stop being distracted and start building real understanding. How many are prepared to trade comfortable ignorance for the burden and beauty of consciousness? How many have the courage to become psychologically sovereign? When you write those words, you're making a declaration. Not to me, not to other viewers, but to yourself. You're claiming your birthright as a thinking being. You're choosing development over distraction. You're stepping onto the path that leads to genuine freedom. And here's what happens next. The algorithm that brought you this video, it's watching. Every person who clicks like right now, who subscribes to this channel, you're sending a signal. You're telling the system that consciousness matters, that depth beats distraction, that real thinking still has an audience. That signal, it doesn't just help this channel. It helps every person who needs to see this message. The man scrolling endlessly who doesn't know why he feels empty. The guy going through the motions who can't remember the last time he thought deeply about anything. The person who senses something is wrong, but can't articulate what. Your engagement right now reaches them. Your decision to like and subscribe creates a pathway for this message to find the people who desperately need it. You're not just consuming content, you're participating in the spread of consciousness itself. And there's something else coming. Something that will take everything you've learned here and push it even further. The next video reveals a truth about modern life that nobody wants to acknowledge. A pattern so obvious once you see it that you'll wonder how you missed it. A reality about human nature that explains why most people live in quiet desperation. The philosophers saw it coming. The psychologists documented it. The great thinkers warned us, but nobody listened. Until now. That video drops soon. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because missing it means missing the key that unlocks everything else. The understanding that makes all other understanding possible. This isn't the end of your journey toward consciousness. This is where it truly begins.